The 30th lesson focuses on United States President Herbert Hoover and the Great Depression. We're going to start by taking a look at who Hoover was the man and consider the extent to which he is a number of things, perhaps the last of the old style American presidents and the first of the new. And we're also going to consider to what degree Hoover was responsible for not responding to the Great Crash and, in effect, making the Great Depression happen and get worse. We'll see that Hoover does many things, many of which are ineffectual, many of which some could argue are too little too late. But history and the people of America at the time have both judged pretty generally President Hoover quite harshly. I will take a more understanding tone, but at the same time, we need to, on balance, determine whether or not this is a man who failed at his fundamental job of protecting the American people from the collapse of the economy. A couple quick points I want to make about Hoover before we continue on. Firstly, who is this man? He was probably one of the most popular politicians, and certainly the most nationally popular politician before he became president. He had become a hero in the 1920s for as Secretary of Commerce, encouraging business at the end of the First World War when the economy slowed down due to the natural contraction in demand following the end of the First World War, in convincing employers to work with their employees. He he, under firstly Warren G. Harding and then Calvin Coolidge as Secretary of Commerce, had really convinced people about a concept they called voluntarism, the idea that they would voluntarily cut back production and voluntarily not lay off staff in order to sort of get through the depression without any major economic consequences and layoffs. Everybody would have to accept a little bit less, and he was able to do that, and it put off the minor blip in the American economy at the end of the First World War. I'm talking about 1919 to 1920. Herbert Hoover sort of based his belief in everybody working together based on his background. He was a Quaker. The Quakers are a Protestant, more fundamental religious group. He was from the Midwest. He was from Iowa. He was an incredibly intelligent man. He went to Stanford, one of the best colleges in the United States. He himself, a self-made millionaire, became incredibly wealthy by starting a mining company that mined coal primarily and a little bit of oil later on. He had, with his sort of self-made American dream, had endeared himself so much to so many Americans that he was appointed Secretary of Commerce in the Harding administration, and again serving in the same role under Coolidge. Um, Hoover's personal, I've talked about voluntarism. His personal let's just say regard was also helped by the fact that he helped to raise $50 million, a humongous sum in the 1920s, for relief in the middle of the 1920s when the Mississippi River, which flows through many states down the middle of America, burst its banks and led to widespread flooding in cities such as Indianapolis and Louisville, Kentucky. Um, the other issue, though, is that Hoover, probably in a large part due to his Quaker fundamentalism, became incredibly fixed in his fundamental beliefs, not only in religion, but in particular relation to the economy. He believed in self-reliance. He believed that charity should help rather than government should help people. He believed in rugged individualism, the idea that, and we've talked about this before, that Americans could, through their own efforts, and should, through their own efforts, find themselves out of any hardship. In other words, you find yourself in of your own doing, and you get yourself out of your own doing. He also believed fundamentally in the equality of opportunity, the idea that anybody could make it. And he was probably naive in this respect because he was completely unwilling to accept that different groups or different strata in society were separated by race and geography and that had an inequality of opportunity. When Coolidge decided not to run and retired in 1928, Hoover runs and is elected very, very, very convincingly. And he had promised that we shall soon, he says, with the help of God, be in the sight of a day when poverty will be banished from this nation. Unfortunately for Hoover, he would preside over the greatest extension in human poverty in American history. The Great Depression, which starts about 7 months after Hoover becomes president of the United States, with the onset of the stock market crash, will lead to greater poverty than ever. Just one last point on Hoover before we move on. One of my favorite quotes is Hoover had used a 17th century French slogan as his real slogan in the 1928 election, which leads to his ultimate landslide victory. It said that a chicken in every pot and a car in every garage. Basically, he was extolling the virtues of the Republican presidents who had preceded him and effectively saying that the wealth shall continue under Hoover. And boy, was he wrong. So, to what degree was Hoover the first of the old presidents, the first of the new presidents and the last of the old? So, we have to see how much he held on to the old way of thinking, that laissez faire stuff, and then how much that changes, both as a consequence of his realization that it was wrong and in the context of the Great Depression. Now, we got to look at what Hoover does, and we're going to start with the issue of voluntarism right now. Okay, firstly, voluntarism is a real good symbol of Hoover misjudging the economic situation in America. Voluntarism proved unrealistic and unworkable. By 1931, even the largest industrial companies were unable to sustain the agreement. Hoover had promised federal investment in public works to ensure employment and social support. However, to pay for these schemes, he reintroduced and increased taxes. Effectively, as the Depression deepened, workers kept being laid off. Additionally, into regards to the Agricultural Marketing Act, and you could read a little bit more about the details, but I'll basically say that this helped exacerbate the situation by offering support for farmers, and in this case, and then industrialists in other cases, he basically meant that he focused on the wrong things. Agricultural workers were suffering before; they were already out of work. These people, in other words, what you really need to focus on were the industry. Not only that, he had no power to order the reductions in production that he said. It bought grain prices at a level above market value and therefore threw taxpayers' money away. It also encourages farmers to produce too much. Effectively, the Agricultural Marketing Act was a disaster. One of the other things he's rightly criticized for is the Hawley-Smoot tariff. This puts duties on industrial and agricultural items of up to 40%. And what this means, as a result, is that European markets are reluctant to import US goods. This is known as protectionism. Okay? And protectionism, in regards to tariffs, is counterproductive. International markets become confrontational, and foreign relations are fundamentally damaged. In fact, farmers, above all, hated it. They campaigned against it, and it narrowly passed through the Senate. In fact, Hoover, when begged by the farmers, actually refused to veto it. International trade fell by 1.2 billion in 1931. Now, in order to sort of spur international trade and to make up for the problems caused by the Hawley-Smoot tariff, amongst other things, Hoover decided to introduce a moratorium. That is a postponement of the war debts that were being paid by European countries such as Germany, Britain, and France to the United States for the money they had borrowed and the goods that they had used made in America for fighting the First World War. This gesture needs to be considered too little and too late to assist the European economies. Consequently, their monies were not diverted to investment in the U.S. economies as Hoover would hope. So he had basically said and hoped that I will take this moratorium. You won't have to pay back your war debt, but you should also invest in American-made products. Didn't happen. Their money goes into the whole host of other issues that they have to confront, paying for soup for their own people, putting roofs over the head of the homeless, etc., etc. Anyhow, continuing on. Hoover also wanted to stick to the gold standard. His monetary policy in this respect was an absolute disaster. By defending the dollar and remaining on the gold standard, this increased deflation. In other words, it meant that the United States dollar remained incredibly expensive to buy vis-a-vis other dollars, which meant that, consequently, if you were a German with your deflated dollar and you wanted to buy American-made products, they were just simply too expensive. Now, when a dollar, or a pound in our case, deflates, it means that more overseas buyers have access to the things you make because they can be obtained for cheaper. And access to the gold standard, or by sticking to the gold standard, actually hurt the Americans' economic position and put them at a competitive disadvantage compared with countries that gave up gold, for instance, Britain for that matter. Another thing he does is what's known as the National Credit Corporation. Credit is incredibly important. They need to borrow. And this was set up by bankers to help banks survive. It began with a fund of $500 million and donated by financial institutions. This is something that Hoover encouraged, okay? He did not invest in this, but he encouraged through his volunteerism the fact that he needed to do it. The banks working together. Banks continued to fail, but by the end of 31, the corporations had only spent 10 million of the 500 million put in it. The corporation effectively dies. What that means is without the federal government encouraging them to inject money into the economy, the National Credit Corporation is nothing but a sort of a white elephant and a sort of a token assistance to banks that were on the risk of failing. Banks always put their financial concerns ahead of their own interest, and unless forced to by a large bank, they won't get involved. Another example of something that was completely insufficient that Hoover did was known as the Federal Home Loan Bank Act. Effectively, to save people's mortgages, they made credit easier. In other words, easier to pay back. They would lend back or lend them 50% of the value of your property. Okay, and federal home loan banks are set up across the country, and this meant that you could borrow in order to pay off 50% of your devaluing property. This was completely ineffective. It was completely insufficient to deal with the severity of the situation. Homes were repossessed on a massive scale, and more people became homeless between 1930 and 1932 than any other time in American history. The next thing he does is what's known as the President's Emergency Committee for Employment. He had promised to spend massive amounts of money to get people back to work. He had been given $500 million from Congress in 1932 to help various agencies provide relief, but it wasn't nearly enough. He needed way more money. He set up this committee to help organize these agencies' efforts. And, what ultimately happens is he reduces direct federal relief. He fears that, instead of giving so much money, the $500 million promise, he only ends up loaning about $47 million. He is so hardwired to his belief in individualism that he gets this access to this money that, if injected into the economy, would severely curtail the effects of the Depression. But even during the severe drought in the South of 1930-1931, he balked to use the money that Congress had authorized him to spend on fixing the Great Depression. He believes, and he's completely tied to that notion of rugged individualism, that sort of belief, that hardwired belief that Americans needed to do it for themselves. It made him seem, and in reality, made him an ineffective manager of the Depression. One of the other things that Hoover received a lot of credit for, perhaps unnecessarily because he didn't order the actions of the army to do this, but in effect, he is blamed for it. Mostly, well, he didn't order it, but he supported it. Let's just leave it that way. Is what's known as the bonus army. In 1932, veterans from the First World War conduct a march on Washington, D.C. There are 20,000 of them in this march. And they basically start camping all over the capital, Washington, D.C. And what they were demanding was the government allow the early payment of their pensions, which they had earned for their service in the war. Now, at this particular time, pensions would be paid at the age of 60. Now, the government during the Depression couldn't afford to pay the bonuses to all of these soldiers from the First World War, many of whom were unemployed and looking for some way to get money. As a result, Hoover doesn't budge. He says, we're not going to do anything about the bonus army whatsoever. These people camp across Washington and they refuse to move. The Secretary of War is called in, and he gets General Douglas MacArthur. You may have heard of MacArthur before. MacArthur led the American forces and the United Nations forces in the Korean War. MacArthur famously directed the Pacific campaign against the Japanese in the Second World War. And MacArthur, gets a little bit of experience here by effectively rolling in tanks and infantry and tear gas to remove the squatters in Washington, D.C. One of the tragedies of the Bonus Army is two babies are killed in this action, if you will. Now, although Hoover supports the violent action taken and, of course, the work of the Secretary of War and MacArthur, um, he comes off as incredibly unsympathetic. The American people are massively horrified. This is, of course, killing babies. This is also the ill treatment of war heroes, and they blame him. This is one of probably the most massive political blunder in all of his career. He'll eventually set up a veterans administration to try and help this as sort of a consequence, but he will never actually outlive what happened in the Bonus Army. The last thing he does, and it's really the perhaps too little too late, is Hoover makes a massive U-turn on policy. He creates, in January 1932, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. This is a radical step forward in government intervention to help the economy. It's really a forerunner to Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal. He gets the authority to lend up to $2 billion to rescue failing banks, insurance companies, railroads, construction companies. This will help, he believes, restore confidence in the financial institutions that make the backbone of American society. The big issue with the Reconstruction Finance Corporation is A, it was too little, and B, it was too late. But also, let's take a look at the nitty gritty. Firstly, 50% of the money loaned goes to only 7% of the people who need it. The biggest loans went to the biggest businesses. Big companies employed the most people, though, so that was sort of how it was justified. To address the public disgust that the government were still not giving direct relief to individuals, he'll support the Emergency Relief and Construction Act as an aspect of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. And this will give the RFC authority to loan in another $1.5 billion to bankrupt states to finance public works to get people back to work. Hoover ultimately is too little too late. He's completely shackled to those ideas that it was really up to American individualism. And when he goes to that extra step by getting the American federal government fully involved in the economy, it is way too little too late. Coolidge, interestingly enough, will even criticize him. Coolidge will come out and say, today there seems no class nor section where Hoover is strong or where a decision is respected. Ouch. So let's account for Hoover's response to the crash and break it down for you before we sort of sum it all up. This has been a question before, and so we have to break down all of the things he did really into sections. So let's deal with early, middle, and late Hoover in our analysis of this particular question. Some initial considerations we have to think of. Sometimes it's overlooked that Hoover comes in 7 months, the crash happened 7 months after he's become president. So he'd really established himself as a sort of the pro-business continuum of the 1920s boom guy. As a result, Hoover's response to the crash initially can probably be forgiven as he realizes or tends to think that this is a compensating mechanism after sort of the irrational boom of the market economy of the bull market of 1927 to 1929. In fact, Hoover is merely a mouthpiece for just about every economic thinker in America at the time. Andrew Mellon, Secretary of the Treasury, basically says, oh, don't worry about this crash. It's not that big deal. It's just a small market correction. This has happened before. It's a panic. Don't worry about it. So it's also important to remember here as well that the federal government can do very little. So we want the federal government to step in and do everything, but in reality, the American system is sort of decentralized to the degree that the federal government can only loan money to the states at best, and then the states have to distribute it as they see fit. So in other words, they can turn the cash valve on. They can't necessarily direct where it's going, not particularly that much, or at this point in 1920 anyhow. So what's the first stage? Let's just call it the insufficient response to the crash, okay? Returning to his old methods. We've talked about this. Voluntarism, okay? To his credit, I suppose you can say he realized that the crash was becoming severe. He attempted to do something big. However, in reality, neither the Agricultural Marketing Act or voluntarism were really enough, and they're certainly not effective. The middle stage, when that really depression gets too deep, he does not act sufficiently due to his ideological reasons. Hoover wants to balance the budget. He believes in that sort of the orthodoxy that you don't spend more than you take in. Therefore, borrowing to, invest in the downturn in the American economy isn't something he wants to do. He refuses to get off the gold standard, which deflates the American dollar, makes American goods incredibly expensive abroad. Anything he does with international markets, including the moratorium on war debts, doesn't actually increase spending on American goods, mostly because he didn't inflate his dollar, and American goods were massively expensive. Anyways, long story short, all of this is woefully inadequate. And then sometimes in that, he makes incredibly stupid decisions, such as not vetoing the Holly Smoot tariff as the farmers had wanted him to. This tariff becomes one of the highest in American history and basically shuts American goods out of all foreign markets due to retaliatory tariffs or protectionism by countries that had once traded with the United States. Only at the very end of his presidency, in the run-up to the 1932 election, does he actually take the drastic steps needed. But as we said, the Federal Reconstruction Finance Corporation that he sets up in January 1932 is a wonderful example of too little, too late. And in fact, at best, too, he's still criticized for failing to assist the small businesses and private individuals. So he has to set up the additional, within that, Emergency Relief and Construction Act. And lastly, he deals with the international component of the crash as miserably as anyone could imagine anyone doing. Of course, he goes off, the UK goes off the gold standard in 1931, which increases their ability to operate in international markets competitively. America doesn't. That orthodoxy that I talked about meant that he balanced his budget, he cut expenditure, tax revenues fell, and the country remained on the gold standard, which led to deflation. Hoover should have followed to the UK's example and drop the gold standard. How it would make inflation rise, debts easier to pay for farmers, etc. But he just refuses to do this. Instead, he places further strain on the government and accelerates the economic decline. And lastly, by defending the dollar and remaining on the standard, he limits investment to a massive degree. So what's our overall evaluation of Herbert Hoover in this respect? Number one, he can't be exclusively blamed for not realizing the magnitude of the depression. So it's one thing to say that it's all his fault. Don't say that. Nobody did. Nobody really underestimated them. The brightest minds, including Andrew Ballin, et cetera, did not realize that this was going to be as bad as it did. Okay. The international dimension of the Wall Street crash and the situation in 1929 to 1932 was new and unique. Never had a president before faced with challenges on a global scale. The panics of 1907, 1893, for example, were localized American issues. This was a national and international crisis, which required international thinking and international coordination that Herbert Hoover did not have. Okay. His greatest steps can be seen in the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. And if you want to give him a little bit of a break, you can say that this inspired the New Deal. It was a forerunner. It made the New Deal more palatable. And the steps that Franklin Delano Roosevelt today will take to deal with the worst of the Depression more effectively than Hoover are laid by the groundwork, the foundation Hoover makes. Okay. Hoover was too orthodox. And I think his greatest criticism, here is a man completely shackled to his beliefs. Okay? His personal philosophy, his refusal to go in as far as needed to in order to fix this situation, and then consequently his massive U-turn in the Reconstruction Finance Corporation make him wildly unpopular. They say, okay, if you're going to be orthodox, you can't all of a sudden now change and say, no, I'm not orthodox anymore. Basically, people didn't trust him. It showed a lack of comprehension of the reality of the situation for individuals. It ensured personal ridicule. People named shanty towns after him. They were called Hoovervilles. People who slept on the streets with nothing but a newspaper to keep them warm, called that newspaper a Hoover blanket. A general lack of confidence in his policies is directly attributable to what he does or doesn't do during the Great Depression. And he does deserve his share of the responsibility. Okay. Overall, Hoover does bear a huge amount of responsibility for making the situation worse, though he cannot be blamed for the Depression exclusively. Okay, you have all sorts of other issues that lead to the depression. And we've talked about these: the overextension of credit, the uneven distribution of wealth, overproduction, proliferation of small, weak banks. All of these make the Great Depression happen. Hoover, in essence, perhaps makes it worse. So, again, why another question that's come up: why did he take no effective action to contain the depression? Number one, he misread it. Number two, his beliefs, his economic orthodoxy. Rather, let's just deal with his economic orthodoxy. What he does, he wants to balance the budget and stay on the gold standards. And then, thirdly, his belief in rugged individualism of the American individual prevent him from doing that. You'd have to flesh those out, but certainly you have the information from that. Um, some have also considered Herbert Hoover the unluckiest president in U.S. history. Perhaps they had argued that he had done so because he had come into office in great acclaim and months before the stock market crash, and then had this crash that was really none of his doing thrust upon him. They argued perhaps that the Depression wasn't his fault, but he made it later. You can sort of deal with that yourself. His change in favor of more federal involvement is too late. A lot of this is repetitive, but this is some of the arguments that you may get. In effect, what we can say, though, is that perhaps he wasn't unlucky. His policies do amount to let the rich guys who got us into this mess get us back out, and it goes really horrible. And that's Hoover's fault. Remember, we're talking about the Hoovervilles, the shanty towns, the Hoover blankets. Oh, I forgot to mention, broken down cars get called Hoover wagons. Empty box cars that used to carry freight from town to town, city to city, are known as Hoover Pullmans, as they sit idly rotting on the sidings of next to railways. Small varmints that were hunted down and eaten, such as squirrels, such as rats, which became very common food, and especially in the inner cities, get known as Hoover hogs. You're going to have an Easter dinner and have a nice Hoover hog for dinner, which meant a boiled rat. And that was, unfortunately, the situation for many of America's poor. So what do we overall say about him? The worst miseries of the Great Depression bear his name. This doesn't necessarily bode well for his campaign for re-election. In 1932, he's faced with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Not necessarily the most charismatic man, not necessarily the most intelligent man, but a man who gave America hope. He sold the message of hope and change, and in many ways acted upon it. Perhaps all of the blame that Hoover is levying on Hoover is perhaps too much and unfair, but this anger really coalesces against Hoover after his treatment of the bonus army. Roosevelt will win a pretty spectacular victory with 57% of the popular vote and less than 40% for Hoover. Roosevelt will carry all of the electoral college votes in all but 6 states. It's pretty resounding. Voters become thoroughly disgusted with Republican governance, and the next 4 presidential terms are carried by the Democrat Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He is the longest serving president. We'll get into why in another lesson, but they're also followed by yet another Democrat afterwards, and don't return back to the Republicans until the 1950s. In fact, one more other point: voter disgust with Republican governance doesn't end. The GOP will lose 12 Senate seats and 101 seats in the House, meaning that when Roosevelt enters the office, he has a Congress that will do whatever he says. It's strongly backed. The Republicans lose their majorities in both houses. They lose the presidency and are in effect on the backbenches of American politics until late in the 1930s, when people start to get frustrated with Roosevelt too. But we'll come to that in another lesson.